Disclaimer.
Stop listening to the calm voices. Stop trusting the official explanations. Because what U.S. monetary policy is doing right now is not neutral, not balanced, and not accidental. It is applying pressure, and silver is where that pressure is being absorbed. I'm Andy Huang. This is Economy Record, and what I'm about to show you is why the fear you're feeling around silver is not irrational. It's engineered. For the past few years, you've been told a familiar story, that interest rates are being raised to fight inflation, that liquidity is being drained to cool the economy, that markets are simply adjusting. That story is incomplete, because monetary tightening does not affect all assets equally. It never has. When the Federal Reserve tightens, it creates stress, and that stress has to go somewhere. Stocks absorb it through volatility, housing absorbs it through affordability collapse, banks absorb it through balance sheet strain, silver absorbs it differently, silver absorbs it as pressure. Pressure through margin calls, pressure through liquidity withdrawal, pressure through paper leverage. This is why silver often looks weak before it becomes explosive. And this is where fear should start to set in. Because when policymakers tighten into a highly leveraged system, they are not just slowing demand. They are forcing stress into the weakest pressure valves. Silver is one of those valves. Not because it is weak, but because it is honest. Silver reacts faster than statistics. Silver reacts before narratives are rewritten. Silver reacts while policymakers are still pretending everything is under control. That makes it dangerous. When silver rises freely, it exposes inflation before the CPI admits it. When silver tightens physically, it exposes shortages before headlines acknowledge them. When silver decouples from paper markets, it exposes leverage the system cannot afford to explain. So monetary policy leans on it, not openly, not directly, but relentlessly. This is why tightening cycles are almost always accompanied by pressure on metals, especially silver. It is not about killing demand. It is about containing the signal. And here is the part that should make you uneasy. Pressure is not applied because the system is strong. Pressure is applied because the system is fragile. When confidence is solid, you don't need to lean on signals. When debt is manageable, you don't fear honest pricing. When credibility is intact, you don't care what silver does. The fact that pressure exists tells you everything. It tells you that silver is no longer just a market. It is a stress indicator. And stress indicators are never treated gently by monetary authorities. They are suppressed until they fail, or until something else breaks first. That is the environment we are in now. In the next chapter, I'll show you what monetary tightening really does behind the scenes, and why silver always feels it first. To understand why silver is under pressure, you first have to understand what monetary tightening actually is. Not the textbook version, but the real one. Monetary tightening is not just higher interest rates. It is the removal of oxygen from the system. When the Federal Reserve tightens, three things happen simultaneously. Liquidity disappears. Leverage becomes dangerous. Debt becomes heavier. This is not evenly distributed pain. It never is. Tightening does not hit the strongest balance sheets first. It hits the most sensitive pressure points, and silver sits directly on one of those points. Here's why. Modern markets run on leverage. Assets are not just owned. They are financed, rehypothecated, margined, and rolled. When rates rise and liquidity drains, leverage becomes unstable. Something must be sold. Something must absorb the stress. Silver is often that something, not because it is weak, but because it is liquid enough to be sold, yet small enough to be pushed. Stocks are protected by narratives. Housing is protected by politics. Banks are protected by backstops. Silver has none of those protections. So when monetary tightening begins, silver becomes a pressure sponge. Margin requirements rise. Funding costs increase. Paper positions become harder to roll. This forces selling, not because fundamentals changed, but because the cost of carrying exposure changed. And this is where fear should start to sharpen, because what you're seeing in silver during tightening cycles is not price discovery. It is forced behavior. Silver prices get pushed down not because demand vanished, but because leveraged players are being squeezed out. At the same time, physical demand does not disappear. It often increases. But physical demand moves slowly and quietly, and while paper markets move fast and violently. This creates a dangerous illusion. It looks like silver is weak. It looks like silver is failing. It looks like silver is being rejected. In reality, silver is being used as a shock absorber. This is why silver almost always suffers early in tightening cycles, and why it often explodes later. Because once forced selling ends, what remains is structural demand colliding with reduced supply. But policymakers are not focused on that future. They are focused on the present. They need liquidity drained. They need leverage reduced. They need signals quieted. And silver, by its nature, reacts immediately to monetary stress. This makes it both useful and dangerous. Useful as a release valve. Dangerous as a truth teller. That is why tightening does not fix silver. It loads it, like compressing a spring. And springs do not disappear under pressure. They store energy, In the next chapter, I'll show you why silver feels tightening more brutally than stocks, and how liquidity drains target paper metals first. When monetary tightening accelerates, liquidity does not vanish evenly. It drains through the weakest, most leveraged channels first, and silver sits directly in that path. This is the part most people misunderstand. They assume tightening is about cooling demand. It's not. It's about breaking leverage. Modern financial markets are built on borrowed time and borrowed money. Assets are not just owned. They are financed, rolled, and layered on top of each other. Silver is one of the most leveraged markets in existence. Not in headlines, not in public narratives, but in structure. Paper silver exists in quantities that dwarf physical supply. Futures, swaps, options, ETFs, all stacked on top of a relatively small physical base. That structure works only when liquidity is abundant. When liquidity drains, it becomes unstable. Here's what tightening actually does to silver. Funding costs rise, margins increase, collateral requirements tighten. Suddenly, holding paper silver becomes expensive. Not risky in theory, expensive in practice. Positions that were easy to carry during easy money become burdens during tight money. This forces liquidation, not because silver is unwanted, but because leverage can no longer be sustained. This is why silver often falls hardest when monetary stress increases. It is not being rejected by the market. It is being sacrificed by the system. Large players sell what they can sell. Silver is liquid enough to unload quickly, small enough to move without breaking the entire market, and disconnected enough from public outrage to be targeted. Stocks get narratives, bonds get protection, banks get facilities, silver gets pressure. This is also why silver diverges from physical reality during tightening. And while paper positions are being flushed out, physical demand often strengthens. People hedge, industries secure supply, inventories get locked up. But paper markets don't reflect that immediately. They reflect forced selling. This creates one of the most dangerous illusions in markets. That silver is weak at the exact moment it is becoming tight. That illusion serves a purpose. It keeps attention away. It discourages participation. It suppresses the signal. From a policy perspective, this is convenient. From a structural perspective, it is explosive. Because leverage does not disappear. It relocates. Once weak hands are forced out, remaining positions are held by stronger players with longer time horizons. At the same time, physical metal keeps leaving circulation. That is how tightening plants the seeds of instability, not by eliminating demand, but by separating paper from reality. Silver feels tightening first because it is where liquidity stress shows up fastest. Not because it is fragile, but because it is honest. And honest markets are always the first to suffer when systems are stressed. Here is where almost everyone misreads what's happening. They see pressure on silver and assume it means weakness. They see tightening and assume it means suppression will work. They see selling and assume the story is over. That conclusion is wrong, because pressure is not bearish in structurally constrained markets. Pressure is preparatory. When monetary tightening pushes down on silver, it does not eliminate demand. It does not fix supply. It does not resolve the contradiction. It loads the system. Think of it this way. If silver were truly unwanted, it would not need pressure. If silver were irrelevant, it would not need to be leaned on. If silver were harmless, it would be ignored. Pressure exists only where something resists, and silver resists because it sits at the intersection of monetary stress, industrial necessity, physical constraint. That combination makes it stubborn. Tightening cycles always follow the same emotional arc. First comes denial. Silver is weak. The market doesn't care. Then comes exhaustion. Anyone who believed in silver was wrong, and then comes silence. No headlines, no attention, no excitement. This is the phase policymakers prefer, because silence keeps confidence intact. But history shows what happens next. Pressure does not dissipate quietly. It either forces a release or breaks something adjacent. And when release happens, it is not gradual. The reason is simple. Tightening removes leverage, but it does not remove need. Industrial users still require silver. Energy systems still require silver. Supply is still constrained, so pressure accumulates below the surface. The more aggressively silver is leaned on, the more distorted the market becomes. Paper prices disconnect further from physical availability. Spreads widen. Inventories become strategic rather than liquid. At that point, the price you see is no longer informative. It is managed. This is the danger zone. Because managed prices create complacency right up until they fail. And when they fail, they do so suddenly, because the system has been storing tension instead of releasing it gradually. This is why pressure phases are always misinterpreted as bearish. They feel controlled, they feel contained, they feel deliberate. But containment is not resolution. It is delay. And delays in constrained physical systems do not end gently. They end in repricing, rationing, or control. Silver has gone through this cycle before. Every major monetary tightening period applied pressure to metals. Every major release phase followed once tightening collided with reality. This is not optimism, it is pattern. Pressure means silver is still relevant. Pressure means silver is still dangerous. Pressure means the system is still afraid of what it signals, and fear is never applied to something that doesn't matter. At the center of all this pressure is one thing the system cannot escape. Debt. Not normal debt, not cyclical debt, structural debt, the kind that cannot be paid down, only rolled forward. The United States is no longer managing debt. It is managing confidence in debt. And that distinction changes everything. When debt levels are low, markets can tolerate honesty. When debt levels are moderate, markets can absorb volatility. When debt levels are extreme, signals become dangerous. Silver is one of those signals, because silver does something interest rates cannot. It reflects reality without permission. When monetary policy tightens, it is supposed to signal discipline, control, stability. But when silver refuses to behave, it tells a different story. That inflation is not under control, that purchasing power is still eroding, that real rates are not as restrictive as claimed. That is intolerable in a debt-saturated system. Because debt survives only as long as lenders believe the future will look stable enough to roll it forward. If that belief cracks, the system collapses inward. Interest costs spike, funding dries up, policy options disappear. This is why pressure is applied where it is. Silver is not pressured because it is weak. Silver is pressured because it threatens to invalidate the narrative holding the debt structure together. Think about the contradiction policymakers face. They must tighten to appear credible, but they cannot tighten too much without breaking the system. So they create controlled stress. Rates rise just enough to signal seriousness. Liquidity drains just enough to discipline markets. Pressure is applied just enough to quiet signals. Silver absorbs that pressure because it reacts immediately to monetary distortion. Stocks can be propped up, bonds can be backstopped, banks can be supported. Silver cannot be easily explained away. When silver rises freely, it implies something is wrong beneath the surface. And in a system built on debt confidence, implication is dangerous, so pressure is used as a shield, not to destroy silver, but to prevent it from speaking too loudly. This is the debt trap. The system cannot allow silver to reflect reality honestly, because reality would force hard questions. Can this debt be serviced? Can this currency retain purchasing power? Can confidence be maintained without intervention? Those are questions policymakers cannot answer publicly. So instead of answering them, they manage the signal. And managing the signal buys time. But time does not resolve debt. It compounds it, which is why this pressure cannot last forever. At some point, tightening collides with servicing costs, liquidity drains collide with funding needs, and pressure becomes counterproductive. When that happens, the system must choose, release pressure or sacrifice credibility. Neither outcome is stable, and silver sits directly in the middle of that choice. Here's the part that almost no one explains honestly. U.S. monetary policy does not eliminate stress. It moves it. Stress is never destroyed in a leverage system. It is transferred from one place to another, intentionally or not, and silver has become one of the primary destinations for that stress. When the Federal Reserve tightens, it drains liquidity from the system. That liquidity has to come from somewhere. It does not come evenly from all assets. It comes from the areas that are least politically protected, most financially leveraged, fastest to react. Silver checks all three boxes. As liquidity is withdrawn, banks reduce balance sheet exposure. Hedge funds reduce risk, traders unwind positions. They do not sell what they want to sell, they sell what they can sell. Silver is liquid enough to be sold quickly, it is volatile enough to absorb large flows, and it is small enough that selling pressure does not immediately trigger systemic alarms. That makes it a perfect stress sink. This is how monetary pressure gets exported. Not through announcements, not through policy statements, through funding mechanics. As rates rise, the cost of holding leveraged silver positions increases. As collateral values fluctuate, margin calls accelerate. As liquidity tightens, paper markets compress. This forces selling, even when fundamentals argue against it. The result is perverse but predictable. Silver weakens on paper while physical demand quietly strengthens. Premiums rise even as prices fall. Availability tightens even as sentiment turns negative. This divergence is not accidental. It is the signature of stress being redirected. And this is why silver often looks broken right before it becomes unstable. Because stress is being concentrated. The system is effectively saying, we cannot absorb this pressure everywhere, so it will be absorbed here. That works temporarily. But exporting stress does not resolve it. It accumulates. Each tightening cycle increases the mismatch between paper exposure and physical reality, managed prices and unmanaged demand. Eventually, that mismatch becomes impossible to ignore. And when stress can no longer be exported, it returns to its source. That is the danger, because silver does not generate stress on its own. It reflects stress created elsewhere. When monetary policy pushes pressure into silver, it is not fixing silver. It is shielding the broader system, and shields fail when they are overused. This is why pressure phases always feel controlled, until they don't. Because the system is not reducing stress, it is concentrating it. And concentrated stress always releases violently. Pressure systems don't fail quietly. They hold, they absorb, they bend, and then suddenly they don't. The most dangerous assumption in any monetary tightening cycle is that pressure can be increased indefinitely without consequence. It can't, because pressure does not remove contradictions. It magnifies them. For a time, exporting stress into silver works. Liquidity drains elsewhere look manageable. Debt markets appear stable. Confidence holds. But beneath the surface, something critical is happening. The system is narrowing its margin for error. Each round of tightening does three things simultaneously. It increases debt servicing costs. It reduces available liquidity. It concentrates stress into fewer and fewer assets. Silver is one of the last places stress can be pushed without immediate political fallout. But that capacity is finite, and when that capacity is exhausted, something breaks. Not silver, the mechanism. Here's what failure looks like. Paper markets stop reflecting physical reality entirely. Delivery timelines stretch. Premiums detach permanently from spot pricing. At that point, the market ceases to function as a single system. It splits. One price for paper promises, another price for physical reality. That split is catastrophic for confidence because it exposes what the system has been hiding. That price was never about supply and demand. It was about control. This is where pressure backfires. Once participants stop trusting paper pricing, liquidity disappears completely, not because people are panicking, but because they refuse to participate. Industrial buyers bypass exchanges. Long-term contracts replace spot markets. Inventories get hoarded, not circulated. Silver becomes strategic, not tradable. And when that happens, policy loses its primary tool. You cannot pressure what you cannot access. This is the breaking point. Because when silver exits the open market, stress has nowhere left to go. It flows back into currencies, bond markets, interest rate structures. That is when tightening becomes impossible to maintain. History shows this clearly. Every time pressure mechanisms fail, policymakers are forced into one of three outcomes: sudden reversal, emergency intervention, loss of narrative control. None of those are orderly. None of them are neutral. And all of them are preceded by one thing: a long period where pressure seemed to work. But that illusion is the danger, because systems don't fail when everyone is afraid. They fail when everyone believes pressure is under control. That is where we are now. Silver is absorbing stress, not because it can forever, but because it must until it can't. And when it can't, the break does not happen quietly. It happens where confidence is thinnest and leverage is deepest. Here is the final truth most people never see until it's too late. Pressure is not the end of a cycle. Pressure is the precondition. Every major monetary event in history followed the same order. First, pressure was applied to suppress signals. Then, divergence appeared between paper and reality. Then, confidence cracked somewhere unexpected. Finally, release happened. Fast, violent, and irreversible. Silver is not the story by itself. Silver is the canary inside a leveraged, debt-dependent system. When U.S. monetary policy pushes pressure onto silver, it is buying time. Time to roll debt, time to manage perception, time to maintain control. But time does not eliminate contradictions. It compounds them. Each month of tightening increases the cost of servicing debt. Each liquidity drain reduces flexibility. Each attempt to contain silver deepens the disconnect between price and reality. This is why pressure phases always feel deceptive. Nothing appears broken. Markets still function. Prices still move. But underneath, participation thins. Trust erodes. Resilience disappears. By the time something visibly fails, the system has already passed the point of no return. This is why belief doesn't matter anymore. You don't need to believe silver will break free. You don't need to believe policy is wrong. You don't need to believe in any narrative. You only need to understand one thing. Pressure cannot replace balance forever. At some point, debt demands resolution. Liquidity demands return reality, demands repricing. When that moment arrives, pressure is released not by choice, but by necessity. And releases do not ask permission. They do not arrive gradually. They do not respect expectations. They do not wait for consensus. They happen when the system runs out of places to hide stress. Silver has been absorbing that stress quietly. When it stops, the signal won't be subtle. The question is not if pressure leads to release. The question is where the break appears first, and how quickly it spreads. History is clear on this. Pressure phases end suddenly. Narratives collapse faster than they were built. And those who mistook suppression for stability are always caught off guard. That is the risk of this moment. Not panic, not fear, but false calm.
Disclaimer.